Welcome to the Mining the Dalkey Archive podcast, an occasional podcast in which we talk with Dalkey authors, translators, or fans of particular Dalkey books. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books at the University of Rochester, and this week we have special guest Dan O'Brien. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm good. How are you, Chad?
Pretty good. So, to give everyone a bit of an introduction, I'm going to give a very brief introduction because I assume that anyone listening to this can click on the link in the show notes and go to your author website, which includes a very extensive biography because you've done a lot of stuff. So, this is really just the
I'm
highlights.
just very insecure, so I will try to include everything,
That's the best way to do it, man. Best
like
way to do
high school honors.
it. Third place in the track meet. And
Right, right.
absolutely.
Freshman and sophomore year class president before
Yeah.
I was ousted in my junior year,
Oh,
sadly.
were you? No, that's a
Yeah.
story.
My
I was
heart wasn't in it. I didn't deserve to have that role.
I was the president of our co-op in college for like a semester, but I changed the name of the co-op from Orion to NASA because I thought it would be funny. And apparently not funny to most other people. But
Uh,
anyways, the main reason you're on here is that you've written three books that Dalkey has published that actually cover a number of different sort of styles of writing or modes of writing. The first, Story That Happens on Playwriting, Childhood, and Other Traumas, is an essay collection about the craft of writing. And then there's True Story, a trilogy, which are three plays that we'll talk about in a second that fit together. And then most recently, From Scarsdale, a Childhood, which is now in its second printing and second edition, and includes a new coda, Dear called Dear Family, which we'll get into more detail about. You've also won an incredible number of awards, including the 2024 Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation Theater Visions Fund Award for Newton, which debuted at the Jiva Theater in Rochester, New York, which I was able to see you at and see the play at, which is remarkable. And it's also, I do want to point out, living in Rochester, that you've also written a play about Rochester's most famous people, well, some of their most famous people, the Fox sisters, called The House in Hydesdale, which also premiered at Jiva. And you've also won the Penn Center USA Award for Drama for The House in Scarsdale, which is now part of True Story, and which is where we actually met we got seated at the same
Oh,
table
right.
at award
Yeah.
ceremony where I had been a judge for the translation prize and you were winning for your own work. So
Which that was in like Beverly Hills, right? Wasn't there was
yeah,
some one
yeah,
of the was it
yep.
Beverly Hills Hotel or something?
It was something like that. I was seated next to Jessica and you were just
Oh,
next
that's
to her.
right.
And
Yeah.
we were way in the back. We were like in like the furthest you could possibly be from the screen or from the stage. And
Translations and drama.
yeah, we're like
We were not we were not at the front.
not at the front, but Jessica told a lot of very funny stories and got us shushed many, many times, which is very funny. But anyways, but you're also a poet, which Delkey hasn't published any of your poetry to date, but your book, Our Cancers, came out in 2023 and centered around the joint cancer diagnoses of both you and your wife, Jessica St. Clair, who is also an actress, podcaster, comedian, and working on a memoir, I believe.
Yeah,
Not,
she
yep.
just yeah. I mean, maybe I'm
So
breaking news here, but she did just sell a it's really a collection of essays, but they're memoir humor essays. There's to some degree about some of the challenges, she's had and we've had. But she's an improv sketch comedian, so they are humorous essays. And yeah, so she does it all. And she co-writes, she's co-writing a couple screenplays and a TV pilot is in development with ABC. So what is that, a quadruple threat? She's a
I think
triple, at least a triple threat.
I was trying to figure out how many threats your whole household has as a
We're
total.
very threatening.
It's like everything.
We're very threatening. Her threats are money making, and mine are sort of, artsy, Pyrrhic victory type threats.
But
But yeah,
that's
we both like to do a lot of things. I mean, they're all related.
yeah, yeah. Creative activities. Two very, very
Yeah.
creative people who are accomplishing a ton within this particular world and the various worlds that it touches. So
Uh,
I know I mostly want to talk or want to get to talking about From Scarsdale, the memoir and the new ending to it and like the sort of tragedy that surrounds that.
sure.
But to start out, how did you get into writing, man? How did you end up on this path?
I mean, it's in the memoir. I've got a copy of it right here because the new edition just arrived
Oh,
2 days ago, and it arrived on my brother's birthday. Because sort of the centerpiece
oh.
of the book is when I was 12 and my brother was 17, he attempted to take his own life,
Mhm.
and it was a trauma. It was a trauma, and it it led me to writing at that age. I mean, I was writing the way a 12-year-old writes.
Right.
And before that, I was certainly a creative kid. But it was really around that age, 12, 13, 14, that I started to feel this compulsion to write. It was a way to, it was a way to confess, not to sound Catholic. I wasn't raised Catholic, even though my name's Dan O'Brien, but I'm sure it's in my DNA. It was a way to write about what was going on in my family, to write at first poetry, and then prose, and then plays when I was in college. And I did it often in secret. You know, I was still pretending through high school that I was. Before we started recording, we were joking about how I was class president for 2 years. So I was pretending to be a very kind of, I don't know, mainstream kid. I played sports. I was on varsity high school teams, but I wasn't good enough to actually play. But I was on those teams.
Yep. Yep.
Kind of like that line in Waiting for Guffman, where Eugene Levy says he wasn't the class clown, but he sat next to him, and he learned from him. That's kind of how I was about sports. Um, so yeah, I started writing, directly as a way to, I guess you could say, cope with trauma.
Yeah.
Also because it wasn't just what was happening with my brother that was the trauma. It was
Yeah.
a fairly moderately to severely dysfunctional family.
Yeah.
And so it was a family in which nobody was allowed to even speak about the trauma of my brother's suicide attempt, and various other problems in the family. So writing, very early for me was just a way to cope. I also, around that time, I developed obsessive compulsive disorder. Probably it's hard to prove this sort of thing, but it can be sparked by a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
And it did develop in the months after that. And I found that by writing, my OCD symptoms receded, were a lot better. So, it was a kind of self-therapy because nobody was taking me to therapy.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't take myself to therapy till I was in my early 30s.
Yeah.
Um, and so writing, was a way to feel good, to feel functional. And then
Yeah.
there's sort of the extended effect that once I was actually sharing my work, it gave me an identity, it gave me a sense of purpose and meaning. It connected me to people, in a way. So from an early age, I knew that being a writer was not just my aspiration, but was kind of my identity.
Absolutely. And poetry first, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was still, when I was a kid, I was writing short stories as well.
Right.
But poetry was, yeah, that's the kind of writing that I think felt like the most real to me as a kid. That's where I was writing about what was going on in my family and about what I was experiencing. And that was directly from discovering poets like Anne Sexton or Sylvia Plath or Robert Lowell, you know, um, confessional poets.
Hmm.
And it was a revelation to me, that you could not only write like this, but you could publish it,
Yeah.
and it could mean something to people, that they could become quote unquote famous poets, and it was I don't know, it was a way of feeling that what I was going through wasn't just chaos or trauma or dysfunction or pain, or it was a way that I could feel ownership and control over that chaos,
Yeah.
and that maybe something good could come of it.
Yeah. To stick with the poetry for just a second, like I do want to say all of your books are brilliant and amazing and very, very just like I'm moving and very compelling and interesting. And Our Cancers really was like a heartbreaking and intense book to read.
Mhm.
And, not to segue too much away from the memoir, but do you want to talk about Our Cancers for a second? That was a book that was very important to me, and ended up, my wife gave it to her mother, my mother-in-law, who had gone through breast cancer, and she was very
Yeah.
moved by it. It's like something that like is a very touchstone in our house. So I'm curious if you want to just say
Oh,
a couple, like the background
sure. Well, yeah, I mean, thank you
story.
for saying that. You never know, with writing anything, you never know really who it's reaching,
Yeah.
unless you're writing, I guess, a bestseller or something, and you make millions of dollars, or becomes a film starring Tom Hanks. Um, but I did just hear a couple days ago from somebody, a stranger, who had read Our Cancers, and it's a funny thing. He said he was having a treatment where he was radioactive for a few days. So he had to get away from his family to protect them from the radiation. And so he was in Venice, California, in like an Airbnb or something for a week. And he walked into Small World Books in Venice,
Yeah.
and he found Our Cancers.
Oh, wow.
And he wrote to me because of how it was helpful to him or meaningful to him. But I was also astonished that any bookstore was carrying it because, it is like the only section smaller maybe than the poetry section in a bookstore is the drama section. So for the most part, I'm used to, you go to most bookstores and the poems there are quote unquote classics or the most famous, well-known
Rupi Kaur.
poetry collections of the moment, the big prize winners. So, but no, I think that means a lot to me that it is to some degree reaching people, because I know it's a scary title, it's a scary thing to think about for people. Um, you know, it- Part of so what happened, the backstory of it is that in 2015, my wife Jessica St. Clair was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer, and then 6 months later was actually the last day of her treatment. So she was getting an infusion of chemotherapy. Um, she had to wheel her IV bag down the hallway into another doctor's office where I was, and I received my diagnosis of a stage 4 colon cancer.
Yeah.
So she finished treatment, and I went right into my treatment. So it was about a year and a half total, of either one or both of us, dealing with this experience. Um, but I started, writing the poems during her treatment because going back to what I was saying about my childhood, it just seemed like there was no choice for me, for my mental health,
Yeah.
than to write about the experience of, at that point, being a caregiver to somebody who's attempting to survive cancer.
Yeah.
And then, you know, uh, neatly segueing into becoming the cancer patient, and trying to do the same thing. So that's where those poems came from, and then I revised them for several years, and it actually came out in 2021. The book,
Oh,
the book that came
interesting.
out, and no worries, the book that came out in 2023 is a collection of prose poems that I started writing um, after finishing treatment. So it was sort of because we both finished treatment with no evidence of disease. Knock on wood, we're still in that position. So once you finish treatment and the doctors say, "Hey, you're good. You could be okay for, in this regard forever."
Yeah.
Or you might be back in treatment in 6 months or a year. You don't know. And so Survivor's Notebook is that other collection, and these are prose poems about how do we get back to living a quote unquote normal life,
Right.
And so, Our Cancers, those poems are very, uh, there's no punctuation. They're all poems and tercets. Some of them are almost poetic fragments more than cohesive poems. They're just numbered. There's
Yep.
101 poems in total. Because the experience of what we were going through felt, for lack of a better term, shattering.
Mm.
The poems needed to be kind of fragmentary and to come from a place, other than narrative, if that makes sense. Other than, I mean, it tells a story, but these poems aren't really storytelling poems. They're much more personal. Some people have found them kind of surreal. I think if they have a surreal quality, it's just the surreal quality of being in the midst of trauma. you
Yeah.
know? And then with Survivor's Notebook, I was interested in telling stories again, and that's why they're prose poems. Some
Yeah.
of them are closer to poems, some of them are much more like prose. Some of them are kind of funny. I mean, it's all about the experience of survivorship where you're living with terror, you're living with traumatic memories, but you're also living with astonishment and gratitude and a heightened awareness of beauty and love and so so they're very different books, but they're also just um, seamlessly related too.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know where I got the dates kind of screwed up is that you
No, no worries.
gave me a copy of Our Cancers when I saw you at Middlebury, but that wasn't 2 years ago. That was 4 years ago now,
Isn't that crazy? It's
which
crazy.
is not was not in my mind. So
Yeah.
anyway, so yeah, both books are incredible. Both books are absolutely incredible.
Oh,
So
thanks.
one thing with to talk about the plays for a second too. So True
Sure.
Story is a trilogy that kind of involves two lines to it. One is the work of the word journalist it is Paul Wilson, right?
Paul Watson, yeah.
Oh, Watson, but right,
And he's not the Greenpeace Paul Watson.
right.
Some people confuse me. This is Paul Watson was he's retired now. He was a combat journalist for various papers. When I met him and started to work with him, he was with the LA Times, but he was with the Toronto Star. He's Canadian by birth and citizenship. He was with the Toronto Star when he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1994 for a 93 photograph he took during the Battle of Mogadishu.
Yes.
And it's a famous slash infamous photo, at least it was at the time, of a U.S. Army Ranger desecrated in the streets of Mogadishu. And it had enormous impact all over the world. It caused the U.S. to withdraw from Somalia and from various other entanglements during the Clinton administration. Paul believes, and I think he's pretty much accurate, that that photo's impact around the world sort of emboldened Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was actually present in Somalia at the time, into believing that the right photograph or the right PR stunt, I mean, 9/11 was much more than a PR stunt, but that the right small operation could have huge impact. So Paul really did, in some ways, blame himself to some degree for what came in the years after that photograph. So
Oh,
yeah, I started working with him, oh gosh, 2007 or 8.
wow.
And it turned into two plays that are in that trilogy, True Story. And the third play in that play couldn't have happened without working with him. And they're all sort of in a similar theatrical style
Mhm.
of storytelling. And yeah, so he and I worked together. I wrote those two plays, two collections of poetry about him, uh, very much in his persona. One's called War Reporter, and the other is called New Life.
Right.
As well as we wrote the libretto for an opera by Jonathan Berger um, called The War Reporter,
Uh,
just to confuse things. And Paul and I have had a really meaningful relationship, kind of peculiar in a way, in the sense that he would share, freely of himself with me in terms of allowing me to adapt his life, his work. Uh, and but at the same time, he never read anything I wrote about him.
oh wow, yeah.
Uh, he's never seen the plays. He's never because he didn't. He would say it's because of his PTSD. So he has severe post-traumatic stress disorder.
Only imagine.
So, part of it was he was happy for me to do something with what he'd written or with what he would share with me. Because he would also share not just his writing, but he would share the raw material of his journalism. So a lot of what I wrote about him came out of photographs and video and audio recordings that he would send me from the front lines in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and but again, he would give me free reign to make something of it myself and to make a character of him, you
Yeah.
know. Just like I was making, the reason it's called True Story, this collection, is because, the main characters in all three plays. Well, I'm in all three plays, so it's an
Yeah.
experiment in memoir for the
Hmm.
stage. And in two of the plays, he's a main character. I would argue the main character in those two plays.
Yeah.
And he allowed me to, create someone using his words because I would record all of our conversations. So it was very much a documentary approach,
Right.
and quite time consuming because, for example, The Body of an American is the first play in the trilogy.
Hmm.
So when we first got together, we would email for a few years, getting to know each other. And being, I guess, kind of introverted writerly types, we only emailed. We didn't get on the phone. We didn't get at the time, we didn't get on Skype, if you remember Skype.
Right.
Um, but then I got to a certain point when I was writing the play where I felt like, okay, we've got to meet. And it just worked out that at that time he was trying to get away from war reporting for the first time in 25 years. So he had talked his bosses into being assigned the Arctic and Aboriginal beat.
Right.
So he was up in the high Arctic in Canada for a couple months, and he said in the winter, and he said, well, "Why don't you come on up and join me?" So that's where we met in person, and that's in the play, and a lot of those scenes, all those scenes are derived from us sitting around and talking with my digital recorder on. This was before I had a smartphone.
Hmm.
And so yeah, so it's been a very meaningful relationship to me, and I think it all goes back to trauma again. I don't have war trauma, obviously,
Right.
and I don't want to necessarily compare my sort of mundane, dysfunctional family trauma to some of the horrific things he's witnessed. Um, but that is kind of the hinge of our partnership,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Absolutely.
know.
On a larger scale, or in like a taking like a bird's eye view, I guess, what appeals to you about writing plays, about writing drama specifically? It does seem to have like a totally different set of like, ways that it operates, actions that you can do, ways that you can represent things than does writing
Yeah.
a novel. So I'm just curious about like what about it appeals to you and what do you like about the form itself or the medium, I suppose?
I mean, are you familiar with that term, probably an outmoded term, repetition compulsion in psychology?
Yeah.
It's that idea of, having some sort of maybe trauma or at least a difficulty in your past, your childhood, that you're sort of half consciously or unconsciously continually drawn toward confronting in your life. So let's say you have a bad relationship with your father in a certain way.
Hmm.
You might find yourself continually having relationships with older men that are problematic in a similar way.
Right.
And the idea is that each time you're doing it, your subconscious is saying, well, this time I'm going to get it right. This time I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to resolve the conflict. And sometimes I think I was drawn toward the theater for that reason, as a kind of family surrogate.
Right.
It's such a cliche. It's not just the theater that does this. Companies do this. We're a family, the family of the theater,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
and usually that's said in a positive way.
Uh-huh.
But
True.
of course, it shouldn't be. It's the Tolstoy quote, right? It's like, okay, what's a happy family? How many of them really are happy? Or, we're all on a spectrum with some level of dysfunction. So, there is something compelling to me about and compulsive to me about collaboration,
Right.
uh, as difficult as it can be,
Hmm.
as challenging as it can be, as disappointing as it can be when it works, it's just so thrilling.
Yeah.
When an actor, a director, producer, designers, when they collaborate with something you've written and make it not only realize it the way you hoped it would be realized in three dimensions and time and space, but exceed what you had hoped. That's a feeling of exhilaration and fulfillment unlike any other. The difficulty is that that's pretty rare. Often it's somewhere in the middle. Certain things
Yeah.
about a production can work and be exciting, other things not. Often productions that don't live up to what you hoped, and maybe that's your fault as the playwright, or maybe it's casting, or maybe it's the producer, or maybe it's the critic that came, or who knows. There's so many variables. So you have to be, I think playwrights or anyone in the theater or any collaborative art form, you have to be kind of excited by that
Mhm.
unpredictable quality. I mean, there's, because I write other types of writing, there are all kinds of unpredictable factors, obviously, with a book, with a collection of poems. But I think there's just so many more layers of collaboration in a play or film or TV. And yeah, so maybe I'm just always chasing that kind of resolution of a functional family, a play that communicates what I hope it will,
Yeah.
and the response then feels like love, and then therefore it's a happy family. You know, I don't know. It's also plays. You know how it is. It's like there is nothing. Plays can be awful. They could be horribly boring. They can be you feel trapped. You can feel like you're watching just rich people complain about their lives while sitting on a sofa on stage. All these things that I don't like about the theater. But there is something so profoundly fulfilling to me about sitting in an audience with people, knowing that the actors on stage are there. They're real people. They're not recorded months or years ago on celluloid. Um, and again, I love film and TV, but there's something kind of, and it is kind of the cliche, but it does remind me when I'm in the theater of, being in a church, that feeling of a community. Even if you don't know these people, there's just something healing about it, you know?
I can imagine from an artistic standpoint that, or as an artist, as the writer, that there is something really gratifying about seeing that feedback too. That you get to see
Mhm.
not only is there the family element and these actors and actresses like buying into your vision and trying to enact your vision to the best of their abilities, and that's got to be really like rewarding to see things really come off the page, but then that your audience is there. Like and you can hear them, you can see them, you can feel them versus like when you write a novel or short story, a couple of people are involved, editing, maybe marketing. There's like, but they're not like, acting it out, like
Yeah.
doing their
You're and
specific
you're
job.
not, and if you're the
And
novelist, you're not sitting there staring at their face while they read every page of the novel, you
exactly,
know,
and
looking
reacting.
for their reaction at every moment. Yeah, and then that's true. That's why there's that kind of you know, this is the sort of comparison that Paul Watson would hate, but there is a bit of the adrenaline junkie feeling to being a playwright
Yeah,
that in a very minimalized way reminds me of what drew Paul Watson to combat journalism.
yeah,
Because you're right. I mean, it's not only fulfilling to see the audience laugh or cry or look engaged. That's something you write. You also have to deal with one person laughing and crying and somebody a row ahead of them snoring.
yeah.
Like you have to have that, you have to deal with that cognitive dissonance. Or God forbid, a bad production where everybody looks unhappy.
Right.
That happens. It's happened more with readings where like it's not a very good reading or it's the wrong place for a reading.
Mhm.
And the audience looks like they hate me. They hate the person that wrote this. There's something that playwrights have to do called talkbacks.
Oh yeah.
And if you can get out of it, most playwrights do. But often when a play is in development, which means readings and workshops, but not a fully produced uh, performance, or if it's in previews and it's a new play, they may have a talk back with the audience after the play.
Hmm.
Well, the producers will put the playwright on stage, usually with like a intermediary, a dramaturg from the theater or somebody else, and they'll ask the audience like, "Hey, so what'd you think? What did you think of this play?" And it can go one way or the other. But one of the ways it can go is horribly wrong.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And sometimes that's because the play wasn't working and sometimes it's just a snowball effect. Like the first person who starts speaking, if it's positive or negative, everybody kind of goes that way.
Yeah.
So, especially when I was younger, there are comments from audience members that live rent free in my head,
Oh God.
and I've heard even worse. There's a famous Terrence McNally playwright. He said his first, this was actually a review, but it was like one of his first plays. a critic wrote that the critic wished that Terrence McNally's parents had done the world a favor and smothered the playwright in his crib.
Jesus.
So like there's this hatred that a bad play instills in an audience. Maybe it's true of movies and TV too.
Damn.
I mean, the difference I think is a TV and film, you can walk out of the theater. Again, they're
Yep.
not there in the room with you.
Nope.
It's cheaper. I mean, part of the anger is a lot of plays cost a lot of money to see. I think you often do feel trapped, in that room. So if you're not liking it, you start to feel very angry. Um, so yeah, so over the years, I got better at kind of either avoiding the talkbacks or just kind of smiling and nodding and saying thank you for your helpful comments and
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Just gotta eat it. Oh man.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned this beforehand, but I do have one question about because what we're talking about too is the performance of the plays. So a lot of your plays, if
Mhm.
not all of them, have been published as objects, as book objects that you can purchase and you can read, but it's really the performance that you seem most
Yeah.
interested in and that really makes it. How has COVID affected that? And then as like a kind of a side note to that, the cancellation of all these NEA grants to all sorts of artistic enterprises, including small theaters, and let's just assume the NEA is done and gone forever, probably, but at least for the time being.
Yeah.
How is that impacting you as a playwright and like the drama world as a whole?
I think a lot about it in relation to what my wife deals with in terms of TV and film post COVID, and with TV and film also post a major labor strike,
Yep.
in that the business has really changed, hasn't really come back to where it was in 2019, for example. And that's true of the theater as well. Um, many smaller production companies are just gone, or theater production companies are just gone. Even the well-known established New York off-Broadway theaters and regional theaters, they're doing fewer plays. They're doing shorter runs. They're
Yeah.
doing plays that are cheaper to produce, which could mean smaller cast or unit set or what have you. It's an interesting time also. So that's been a challenge for sure. So there's just fewer opportunities, and the theater was already an anemic art form in terms of, the theater survives on revivals in a way
Mhm.
that TV and film doesn't. TV and film, they're looking for novel concepts for the most part. I mean, I guess you're still dealing with IP these days and sequels and that sort of thing. So that's
Right.
probably a corollary.
Yeah.
But it's not like, every year we have to see a remake of The Maltese Falcon, you
Right.
know. But the theater has always known that they're probably going to make more money doing another production of Shakespeare if they get interesting people involved.
Yeah.
Then if they do a brand new play by even a moderately well-known playwright, it's still going to be a harder sell.
True.
Even a well-known playwright, if it's new, is going to be a harder sell. There was a theater back during the financial crisis. I had a play. It was the House in Hydesville
Yeah.
that you mentioned, the play in Rochester, which is based on local history about the founders of modern spiritualism, the Fox sisters. And that was a very difficult time for theaters. And I think that season, Jiva Theater did two productions of Menopause the musical.
Oh, that makes I think I feel like they did that
No,
since.
no shade, against
Yeah,
Menopause the musical. I think, but the point is, it made for them, it was bringing in a lot of audience,
exactly.
and to do that once a year, it was fine. But they were doing two this year because they're like, we got to bring it back. We need to keep the lights on.
Um,
And theaters every year they make so much of their budget back on A Christmas Carol, for
yep.
example. You
Hmm.
know, so it was always hard to get. It has always been, as long as I've been a playwright, to get new plays produced anywhere. And so yeah, it's just harder now. It's more challenging now. And I think in the last year or so, it's what's interesting is seeing theaters try to balance or find a balance between what I would consider more conservative material, politically, culturally, whatever, that they think is probably going to um, make enough money to keep things going with more challenging, perhaps political plays or musicals. And so, I'm no expert on what's being programmed right now at various theaters, but I think there has been a kind of chilling effect in terms of, you know, sort of a hesitancy by a lot of theaters to do more political work, even though we're living in such politicized times,
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like it's
you
the
know.
place to be doing that, but yet I assume that it is like still risky. And with no like safety net, it's hard to take risks.
Right. Right. And then you've got the NEA pulling out money that was already promised to so many theaters, just like publishers, it's just an insane situation in that regard. And theaters are just like publishers or most publishers, they're not making a lot of money. Nobody in the theater is making a lot of money.
Right.
So, even having, I don't know, a few $100,000 rescinded from the NEA, that makes a big difference.
Yep. Yep.
Portland Center Stage, who premiered The Body of an American, they just recently had to go public with an appeal to raise something like over $1 million in order to continue their season, finish their season. And this is the biggest theater in Portland, Oregon.
Jesus.
And and then they have a longer term plan, I think, to raise something like 3 million to just continue as a theater company at all.
Man,
And so if the sort of establishment theaters are having these challenges, yeah, it's a difficult time.
very.
So during COVID and now, I mean, this is why I was so happy to put together a true story with Dalkey Archive, because I did turn more toward I'm still writing plays, I still have some projects in development, but I was interested in kind of putting them in book form if I could.
Yeah.
Writing, and finishing the memoir, writing in other forms too, because it is a precarious time.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about the memoir. So a funny story that you know and that I'll share publicly is that
Yeah.
I first read the memoir to work with you on it when I had
Yeah.
COVID and was
Oh,
like,
right.
came back from Winter Institute, had COVID, like everyone else did, and was like, this is cool. I'll just lie in bed and read this book. I can just put all my concentration in this manuscript. I have no fucking recollection of doing that. And everything that I read was so confused in my brain. I sent you some message and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And like, seriously, like just diluted. But it's an amazing memoir. And like you mentioned, it
Oh,
opens with your
thanks.
brother trying to take his life, jumping out of an attic window. And I don't well, do you want to talk about a bit about like the timing on how everything happened related to your brother and leading into this kind of new addition and to
Sure.
like your story?
Yeah. I mean, I started the memoir a while ago, really. I mean, I wrote the bulk of it in the current form when I was in treatment for
Mhm.
cancer. So, a lot of it was motivated by that sense of, well, I don't know if I'm going to be around in 6 months.
Right.
So it had, for better and for worse, it had that urgency for me. And uh, and I was remembering things with a clarity that what felt like a clarity that I didn't have before. It's the sort of thing that, again, Paul Watson would talk about in War Zones, where, when he was worried, when his life was threatened, part of the adrenaline rush was that sense of threat gave him a heightened awareness of his life, of what he was doing, not just his past, but his present. And so I'm sure I was feeling some of that. And yeah, I just wanted to write. I wanted to try to capture to some degree in a way that could feel somewhat final. I know it's not final, but somewhat final. Like, what's the story of what I consider, a pretty traumatic childhood? I'm old enough to realize that there are much more traumatic childhoods out there. Um, and I don't, so it's not claiming to be, this, in some ways I'm sort of proud of how it's, a story that I think a lot of people can identify with.
Hmm.
you know, whether it's having a sibling that has some problem, or maybe you have had a problem growing up, or families with secrets, which of course all families do to some degree, and and it's also just the story of growing up that anybody can identify with, right? It's sort of how do you differentiate from where you come from
Yeah.
into who you are, and how you became who you are. So yeah, so I wrote it then, and my brother was still alive. We were pretty estranged. So he had that suicide attempt when he was 17. And then he became kind of, the black sheep of the family. So the opposite of what you would hope
Right.
happened. He wasn't given any help. My parents didn't provide any treatment for him, and if anything, they just kind of wanted to ignore that he had severe depression. What I learned later, he was diagnosed with depression, major depression, social anxiety disorder. There may have been other things going on, but that's what he was medicated for eventually in his 30s and 40s. But he became estranged from my family, um, as did I. I was uh, no one used the word disowning, but I was essentially disowned when I was 32, and have had no contact with my parents or most of my siblings since then. I'm one of six kids. And my brother was estranged from them. I got back in touch with my brother to write the play that's the second play in that trilogy, The House in Scarsdale.
Hmm.
As you can see, I have many titles that are annoyingly similar. And I think that's part of having OCD. I'm very obsessive about things, and so I wrote the play first. The play is derived from interviews with estranged family members,
Hmm.
and he was one of the interviews in the play. And those interviews went a long way in helping me write the memoir then years later, because I had so much more information about what was really going on in my family. And so we got back in touch, and we would email once or twice a year. And then and it was very surface level stuff because he was very difficult to be close to. And during that time, I do know he'd had some hospitalizations, and so he was struggling with this his whole life, his whole adult life for sure. And then uh, right before the book was going to be published, and it was going to late 2023,
Right.
so maybe 6 months before, my brother took his own life. Now, at the time, I wasn't told. I was just told that he had passed away. And so it took me a while to find out the truth and to find out that my parents um, were lying about what happened. And so the book was published with a coda that alludes to his death. Um, but, I wrote it at a time when I didn't know what had happened or how he had died. And I think that had a certain poignancy to it. But, when I found out the truth, there was something, you know, because my story is so much about trauma, but not just trauma, but also denial and secrecy and lies in my childhood. The idea of having this memoir out there with the ambiguity of another lie
Yeah.
as the ending of the book was upsetting to me. So that's why I was so happy and thrilled that we were able to write a coda that is truthful, you know, and tells the true story of what happened with him. And yeah, so I think and even though I guess you could say, well, that sounds kind of depressing. I don't view it that way. I feel like he and I would talk about the few times we talked about what I was writing autobiographically about our family. He was very accepting of it. I did ask him maybe 10 years ago, are you okay that I write about our childhood, that I mention, not just mention, I write about your suicide attempt, your depression? And he said to me, yeah. He said, this was your childhood too, you know.
Right.
And he said, don't worry about me. I just won't read it.
Oh,
And which I loved.
fair.
I loved. He's like, and it's kind of like what Paul Watson does with what I read about him.
Right.
His point of view is like, well, it's your life too, and he was aware that it affected me very deeply what he had gone through. So I believe he would want me to speak honestly about um, about him and also about what he meant to me and what he continues to mean to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, the new edition really is only new in the sense, or revised in the sense of a new coda to the
Incredible.
ending.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which
but
is
I'm so happy it's out there. Very thankful.
Me too. And it really is like, it feels like the right ending to it. And like you say, I totally agree that it all sounds depressing on the surface and sounds very heavy, but the book is not exactly that. The book is very
Oh,
enjoyable. There's a lot to identify with. There's some humor. It's like got a lot going on with it that goes beyond that. And I think
right.
a lot of people will identify it, not just with in terms of like the health struggles, but also with like the division between the family, between you and your family, which has
Yeah.
become like such a very prominent topic over the past few years, probably
Hmm.
exacerbated by COVID, if nothing else. But I get fed so many articles about people like choosing to disassociate with their family or for
Hmm.
whatever reason that happening. And in your case, it wasn't like necessarily a conscious choice, but it did happen. And you writing about that trauma
Yeah.
and exploring it is something that can be very healing for you and also for your readers. So even though this might sound depressing, you definitely should read it.
I
It's
hope so. And I will say, I was surprised in writing it how much humor I found.
yeah,
I think there was one review that said it was obliquely comic at times.
that works.
Anyway, I don't know, that's fair. To me, it wasn't even bleak. I mean, maybe overall you could see it that way.
Yeah,
Because, part of it was healing to me to write because I could recognize how much of my childhood was not depressing, was, kind of joyful and full of creativity and burgeoning sexuality, like all kinds of things that weren't just sad and depressing.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I hope some of that comes through as well.
And it does have enough like there's that part that's resolved, but there are a lot of other pieces that are still like sort of unresolved that you're sort of working with as both in this book and in the plays and in kind of your creative life are really like touching and interesting and
Mm.
watching you sort of handle that is really interesting from like a reader's point of view, at least to me.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Right. So I know that we're running up against your hard stop. So maybe this is a good place to stop unless you want to say plug something that you're working on now. Like what's next?
I don't know. I mean, I'm writing several things right now that may not turn into anything, so I hesitate to say too much about it. I mean, I
Yeah.
do have a pamphlet coming out, as they say in the UK, because it's being published in the UK, which is another long essay slash memoir hybrid that grew out of my experience of the play Newtown,
Oh,
because that's a play about Sandy Hook,
yep.
and the pamphlet is called 40 Questions About a Political Play. And that's going to be published in July. It can be pre-ordered now, but it's part of a 10-year project I've been thinking of, the first 4 years of which are the Slim book, A Story That Happens that you mentioned that Dalkey publishes. Um, yeah, that's probably the only sort of book thing that's coming out soon, and uh, and the other play projects are all in kind of development limbo at the moment. So. But thank you for doing this, Chad. This
It's
has
been
been
great.
great.
It's
And I'm
always
so
fun to
happy
talk.
not only that you published the book, obviously, in the first place, but that you were able to and willing to, let me, in some ways, fix the ending. I don't think there's anything wrong with the way it was before, but it was wrong to me in the sense because it just wasn't the truth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was a truth that I should have had at the time, but it was being withheld from me. So to
Yeah.
be able to kind of right that wrong with this ending is very meaningful to me. So thank you.
Of course, of course. And that's what matters is making sure that the art and the works are the best that they possibly can be and satisfy your desires, the aesthetic desires of a whole, and everyone. So thank you again. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure and like and subscribe. And you can also follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and on the Mining the Dalkey Archive Substack, which hopefully you are subscribed to already. Um, I don't know what the next episode of this will be, although there is one in the works as part of our ongoing investigation of all the Irish books in the Dalkey catalog about the book Groton and Me by Tom O'Neill,
Yes.
which will be coming up in a few weeks. I know that that one's scheduled, so there might be something in between, but if not, buy that book. It is kind of big, but also crazy fun. So until then, I have nothing else to say. So see you soon, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Chad.